Hello everyone and welcome to the ARA's weekly Wednesday webinar. My name is Emma Woods and I'm the Director of Corporate Services and I'm thrilled to have you all here with us today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional landowners on which we meet. Our ARA office is in Canberra and so for me it is the Ngunnawal people. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. We've got a really exciting panel discussion for you all today, and we are joined by team members from Aurecon, Laing O'Rourke and GHD who are working together to deliver the $1 billion upgrade to Sydney's Central Station so that it can integrate with the Sydney Metro network, all whilst ensuring the station maintains operation and is hidden from view of the public. No mean feat. Now, I remind you, for those who have joined us before and for anyone that's new, you can ask questions. We aim to make these sessions interactive. Select the little question mark icon and submit your question at any time during the webinar. I am going to hand over to Jason Pereira, who's the Technical Director from Aurecon, and he's actually going to facilitate this webinar for us today. We've got 4 panel members joining us. So we have from left to right across your screen, we've got Nicole Waterman from Laing O'Rourke. We've got Trevor McMaster from GHD. We've got Liam Wides from Aurecon and also Iris Burkic, also from Aurecon. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us and sharing your experience so far. I will now hand over to Jason to draw all your information out of you. Thank you everyone.
Thanks everyone. As Emma said, I'm Jason Pereira from Aurecon. We had the great delight of being part of the Central Station team, and we thought we would take this brief opportunity to tell you a little bit about what's going on in the station. And as opposed to myself talking for 45 minutes, which is nothing particularly out of the ordinary, I thought I would ask the questions today of my colleagues to get some interesting insights to all of the parts of the station. So I thought I would actually share a video which has not worked because we're in the digital world. So I will talk to just some of the interesting project facts that we can discuss. So the Central Station project started forming a long time ago. Laing O'Rourke, Aurecon and GHD started the pre-tender design in the end of 2016, tender formalised through 2017, and as of March 2018, the contract was awarded and Laing O'Rourke was given the go-ahead to start the $955 million upgrade of Central Station. Central Station being the busiest rail asset within the network within Australia, has over 100 years of history, and this is the single largest upgrade that it's ever received. The primary feature will be adding in the new metro platforms, which will give connectivity to the wider metro network, forming one of the 31 new metro stations that will be delivered as part of the metro system. The Northern Concourse and Central Walk are the 2 main pedestrian and customer-centred design pieces, which will help form part of a broader and more accessible station. The 19-metre wide concourse will connect the new metro platforms and also serve the existing suburban platforms, and for the first time escalators and lifts will be offered to the new suburban platforms, sorry, to the existing suburban platforms. There's also a new eastern entry which will create greater interlinks between the new light rail and the bus network to the eastern suburbs. The primary feature of this is helping give Central Station a new life for the next century. Central Station currently has 250,000 customers a day, but by 2036, it's designed to give 450,000 people a network into the heart of the CBD and creating a new vibrant district for the area. So all that to be done by 2024. So it's no easy task, particularly when every single one of those 250,000 people need to keep using the station. So a lot of today's discussion will be telling you a little bit about the project, but also telling you how we did it behind the simple little hoarding that you often see when you walk through the station. So that's a little bit about the project. So Nicole, I guess I'll open the first question with yourself. How did you first decide partnering and which teams when thinking about how to tackle this project?
That's a good question, Jason. Picking partners on a large-scale project like this is incredibly important. And the process here is we have many processes and procedures of how we pick all of our partners. But for example, for our engineering partners, Aurecon and GHD, this is particularly honed into via the AEO process, the Authorised Engineering Organisation process. That is a requirement for Transport for New South Wales projects. And that narrows down our field of who we could work with in this space. And the size of this project, we also thought we would need more than one. We did think that this project we would need the depth of many consultants, and to make sure that we had the right number of people. We had a number of experiences with both GHD and Aurecon separately, but this is the first time we've all worked together in a joint venture, which has worked successfully.
Fantastic, fantastic. You obviously got the delightful news in March 2018 that you had won. What do you think from the tender submission that Laing O'Rourke provided that resonated most with Sydney Metro and Sydney Trains to help give you the opportunity to do this job?
Yeah, we had some feedback, which was incredible to get some great feedback straight away, but also during the EOI phase, the feedback, and it was something I learned through the tender design I was taught by one of our work-winning leaders, was that a tender is won by 100 different things, and there are different things why these things. And if you look at this slide that you can see with the beautiful canopy, I always thought that was going to be the winning, that's the hero shot, that's the winning shot. That's not the case. There are lots of things that were involved. A couple of our construction methodology of the top-down solution, maintaining platform 12 throughout the construction phase, so that also was appealing to Sydney Trains, that they could maintain all 12 platforms throughout the project. And there are little things like ISCA. So our ISCA rating, we could commit to getting an ISCA rating of at least 70. And at the moment, we're targeting 79. So all of those things add up to a winning tender. It's never just one particular thing that's appealing to the clients. Obviously, the last thing is obviously dollars and other things that come into it.
Excellent, excellent. Thanks, Nicole. So Liam, as the design lead for the project, what were some of the things that you coming in from a risk perspective that you needed to focus on to make sure that we delivered this iconic project safely and efficiently for the team?
Jason, I think first and foremost, we're in an operational rail environment, and that was the thing that really drove a lot of the tender solution and a lot of the design solutions that come out of that. So we know we're right next to operational train lines. We're also in the busiest station in Australia, so we're dealing with both live rolling stock and also customers and people. So there's a lot of work done in the design and also in the construction methodology to look at separating people from plant on the site, but also how we manage people movement and customer movement around the station. But I think the biggest mitigation in all this is getting the trust of Sydney Trains, because we're working right in the centre of their station, and it is the biggest station in the network. It's the busiest station in the network. It's very sensitive. We put a lot of work into both through the design team, in our designs, and also in the construction side, in terms of convincing Sydney Trains that we can do this in a manner that won't disrupt their activities, and they can give us, have the confidence that we'll actually go out there and deliver an asset that they want and not impact their operations. And I think it's gone very smoothly. I think we've done a lot of work to get their confidence and trust, and I believe we have that. And I think Laing O'Rourke have done a lot of work to maintain that. I think the other main risk in any Now, the other main risk in a project like this is ground conditions. So we are, although you'll go out there, if you can see the biggest impact is the surface works, most of the work's actually below ground. So unknown ground conditions are a huge impact on any excavation and tunnelling project. It's a fairly contained site, so there's a lot of geotechnical investigation that goes into this beforehand, but also in the methodologies in design and construction about the ability to adapt to ground conditions as they change during construction.
I was going to say your comment resonated with me once in I can't remember if it was yourself or Nicole who said we had to convince Sydney Trains to let us be the open heart surgeons they needed. So I guess one of the challenges that we did face is taking on a 100-year-old project and bring it into the 21st century. I remember one of my less favourite moments was when we got given an information dump which included just over 1,100 TIFF files with some very interesting information going back to the early part of last century. So I guess, Trevor, I'll throw you a bit of a question. How did the team manage the digital delivery, given so much of the station was either undocumented or wasn't documented to the level that we would work in today?
Yeah, I suppose it was a mixture of traditional methods as well as the utilization of new technologies. So one of the key steps was to digest that information dump that you referenced earlier, along with validating the information that was given to us on site. Close collaboration with the guys on site in Laing O'Rourke, as well as workshops with Sydney Trains themselves, trying to garner as much knowledge from Sydney Trains in regards to existing conditions, existing reticulation pathways and services, any current issues that they're having, which we could also try to identify and mitigate as part of this overall strategy. And then as well as that, in utilization of new technologies such as point clouds. So especially in areas where it's an existing location within the Sydney Trains or Sydney Central Station, where we are looking to repurpose an area for the new scope of works. Point cloud surveys were key to that, to be able to generate a digital engineering environment so it could inform our design.
Excellent. Yeah, no, thanks. Liam, you touched on it a little bit earlier in the in-ground, with the in-ground services, particularly not just from a geotechnical perspective, but also from an operating station environment. How did the project go about investigating what was in the ground and managing and staging those processes, so that we could actually do the excavation we needed to do?
Yeah, I mean, if you know Sydney train station, it's certainly an old place, and there's been like all rail assets, things get changed over the time, and you know, you've got 100 years of buried history out there, and there's also, let's not call it there, there's also another 100 years of European settlement for that, and then the original owners of the land, they were there before then. So there's a lot of layers of history and buried information on the project. All these sort of projects, there's a lot of work done beforehand to do a lot of investigation works, and whenever we plan to break ground, the construction team are always doing pre-investigations, a lot of soft digging to uncover asset below ground information before we actually do the real construction works. But you know, given the history and the heritage of this site, you're never going to be able to find everything. So a lot of it's around designs that are adaptable, having flexibility in the construction, so that when we find something that we weren't expecting, which is inevitable in a job like this, it's how you can then adapt to it, not lose time, you know, recover time and keep the project going. Flexibility is core to all this.
It's an interesting point. Nicole, I guess we've heard from Liam on the design side. From a constructability point of view, how did you plan for that flexibility and that adaptability?
Yeah, the flexibility is in the design, absolutely, and that's helped us with that investigation, and the investigation continues. Every day we find something new that on site that wasn't recorded. So being able to adapt, respond, and alter the design, and having the flexibility in the design to be able to do that, particularly with the services, the existing services. I mean, nobody wants to shut this train station down accidentally. So we take all of that very seriously.
And I guess, Trevor, just coming back to you briefly, in the process of digitising the asset, how critical was that to the design in terms of understanding it, planning it, and then also as part of the handover process? Was that sort of the business as usual approach, or was it a particularly tricky process in this station?
Yes, it was more complex because the project itself is a more complex project than most. That process itself was more complex too, but at the same time, once we got strong methodologies and processes in place for the digital engineering aspects, it made the flow-on effects, like you mentioned there, the handover process much more efficient. So I actually think that the digital engineering aspects of this job is essential to deliver the complexity of a project like this, especially around early planning of spatial requirements for the whole plethora of different stakeholders and different designers and different design teams, which all add up to being the overall project aspects, as well as things that are not necessarily traditional in from a building services point of view, such as delivering large pieces of equipment and being able to visualize and navigate around the model to try to first of all identify and efficiently resolve any issues that may arise from that, which would not necessarily be as easy to do in a more traditional 2D setup when you're overlaying drawings.
Excellent. Nicole, you did touch on in your statement being the top-down construction being one of the big factors of success within the tendering process. How did the team, from a construction sequence point of view, come across what you thought was the winning strategy, and what drove part of that methodology which resonated through the rest of the design?
Yeah, the program really drove all of this. In fairness, it was Metro's wider program. We have the tunnel boring machines, and there was a set schedule of when they were coming underneath Central Station. For those that know, they're already past beneath us now. We couldn't break through below a certain level until after they've completed, and after even the new contractors, the line-wide system connects, has been through as well. So there's a number of dates that we couldn't achieve, and we couldn't do a traditional bottom-up solution. We did try it. We did try and explore the bottom-up. If we could race to the bottom, get there before the tunnel boring machines got there, but we couldn't make it. We couldn't make it in time. It was impossible to do that. So the construction methodology of the top-down, and then the fantastic engineering that comes with the raking columns that we've got to allow the platforms to be column-free, and the diagonal bracing that we have for that solution was pure genius engineering from both the construction and the design teams when we were working that through.
Excellent. I guess, Liam, asking the structural question, how did you, or how did the team approach the redesign of the station? So for those who are aware, there was a reference design that came out, but the tender solution that was developed to respond to the construction methodology, how did that start and evolve, and has it continued to change over time? Sorry, mute. You're on mute.
That's how you tell we're live. To give you, we don't have any drawings here, and engineers love to talk drawings, but let me give you an idea that the platform, the Metro station, is actually 5 stories below ground. So it's actually quite a deep excavation. We're very far below. And Nicole said, looking at a traditional bottom-up approach, we'd have to excavate all the way down to the bottom and then build the structure back up. And not being able to do that and doing a really true top-down construction means that we have to support 5 stories of structure. But we have to build that from the top down. So we do actually have temporary columns which go the full height, and they support the roof during construction, but they get taken out at the end. So the diagonal bracing that came up was a way to actually allow us to properly install all the vertical support high up in the structure, and then hang the permanent structure from that as we build down. So that gave us, it gave us a great engineering solution in terms of we actually then were forced down to a more lightweight structure as we go down. So there's a lot of steel work as opposed to concrete. That has great benefits for the environment because we actually have a lot less concrete in the project, which was a real benefit to us. And then the byproduct of that is you actually get a great architectural outcome, because when you get to the platform level that's column free, it really is just a fantastic open space down there.
Excellent, excellent. So I guess I'll ask a bit of a question. To date, we've been talking a bit about the construction methodology and the structural design. Being responsible for the pedestrian analysis and the customers and how they're interacting with the station, how iterative did your design have to be with the sequencing and of the construction, but then also the sequencing of the structural design within the rest of the design team?
Yeah, great question, Jason. So I guess as part of the overall process, we developed a dynamic pedestrian model of the existing asset. And then as changes occurred through the construction staging, we were able to make those changes within the model to reflect the changes to the asset in order to understand how the pedestrian flow may differ prior to construction actually taking place. We then use this information, or we use this model through various stakeholder engagement pieces in order to understand whether or not there are any items that are missing. and ensure that all the customer needs are met, in particular from a safety perspective.
Excellent, excellent. And I guess, Trevor, we've touched on both structures and sequencing, but from a services perspective, how did the team approach, keeping the asset operational but designing for the future state at the same time?
Yeah, it was challenging. So working closely with working closely with Laing O'Rourke to go through construction methodologies and sequencing. The key to it all was really identifying the areas that needed to be decommissioned, demolished, and then I also identifying the areas that those, let's say, plant rooms were servicing. Any front of house areas, critical operations to the station, all of this needed to be considered in our changeovers. So as an example, from an electrical perspective, a lot of effort went into developing the design to incorporate a lot of easy changeover locations so that a new electrical distribution room was built, commissioned and brought online before the area that was being demolished needed to occur, but a little bit of smarts added to it in the sense that easy changeovers so that it was limited impact to the operation of the station can be conducted over a weekend or at night time when the customer peak was very, very low. So yeah, that was always embedded in all the services designs from day one.
And I guess a bit of a deeper question on that. How did the design sort of have to tell the story of that process in terms of not just here's an existing design and here's the final design? How did the team approach telling the story and the evolution of the design through the various stages?
Yeah, it's all about both for constructability purposes as well as being able to make it intuitive for Sydney trains. And again, it comes back to that trust thing. To make it intuitive, to represent the staging and the design intent of that sequencing. So to make it intuitive to Sydney trains, so to bring them along. Different techniques such as, color coding on drawings for different stages, bringing this online, decommissioning this, stepping it out through the drawing, stepping it out through the design in regards to different stages of that process. The key to it, like we discussed earlier on, was making it intuitive for Sydney trains and all relevant stakeholders to bring them along on that journey and to really get buy-in and endorsement from them.
Excellent, excellent. Thanks. I guess one of the other key themes that I was thinking about in this project was the adaptability and the flexibility that was needed. And I think it's been interesting that some of your answers have already touched on some of the things here. But if I can, I'll delve a little bit deeper. What were some of the key changes in the methodology that needed to be bottom up as opposed to top down? So we've talked about the construction methodology being driven by the program. What were some of the key changes that we needed to implement into the design to reflect the customer-centered nature of what we were doing?
In terms of the final layout?
I guess final and both, yeah, I guess through all stages.
Yeah, so one example that I might use is around the lifts. So when it comes to customers using lifts, you kind of want to make the movement for all users within the station, but I'll use lifts as the example, to be quite intuitive. So when it comes to a user who needs to access the lift to move from different levels within the station, the orientation of the doors and how people actually move through that lift plays a big role in how they move through the station. In particular, to minimise, let's say, the relative crossflow between a individual within a wheelchair or a mum pushing a pram or a dad pushing a pram either, and just the general public who are using that corridor as a walkway or something like that. So that was one element that we considered as part of the overall end state design, particularly for the final station layout.
And Nicole, I guess from an adaptability perspective, were there some key changes that needed to occur based on things you found on site, and how did you respond?
Yeah, a number of things. The biggest impact to us and our program has been in the newspapers, the finding of grave sites within the Devonshire Street Cemetery. So the impact has changed our construction sequence. The slab you can see in this image, which is the track slab and the intercity platforms, that was delayed and sequenced slightly differently to allow us to do the excavations for those. For the grave sites, there is a number of graves that we found throughout that, and as Leah mentioned about the layers of history that are within this site, those things have changed and impacted our construction sequence. A number of other things, obviously, around, and Iris has talked about the stakeholders, the number of stakeholders. So if somebody is saying, no, you can't shut down that corridor for a certain amount of time, then that changes how we sequence something as well. We have to remember this is a live station. Actually, while we're inside, it's impossible to forget.
Yeah, and I think it is amazing looking at the image that we've got up on screen to think that there are pedestrians just a few meters outside of that shot, or probably about 2.5 meters behind where this photo is taken from. We've got people on the other side of that wall. So I think that's one of the really interesting parts of this.
I think, Jason, on that photo, you'll actually see the that corrugated wall at the end is actually a pedestrian tunnel.
Yeah, they're right there. They're
I was just about
literally
to say
walking
that
through the construction site. Yeah. Liam, I guess from managing the design, how did we, or how did you help the team manage the unknowns, and what processes were out of the ordinary or worth discussing and sharing with the team?
Yeah, well, I think this project has a very rigorous assurance process around it. I mean, as an AEO, we are required to put systems assurance in place as an expectation of the industry at these sort of projects. Unknowns are a hard thing because a lot of the information sits in designers' heads, or it's risks we expect on site. We do a lot of risk workshops, and we engage stakeholders quite a bit in risk workshops. We had, I think, at the start of this project, I think we scared everyone with the planned number of workshops we had to run on this. And I think for the first few months, there was a lot of like, well, this is just too much, way too much, and there was a workshop every week at one point. But I think everyone started to realise the benefit of that, and we started to get into acceptance of how we do that. And that leads on to a very rigorous and systematic approach to how to deal with risk and unknowns. And in terms of the design point of view, the sort of unknowns that impact design, they're sort of recorded and tracked out through the whole project. But every unknown becomes an assumption, or everything that we expect we don't know sure that becomes an assumption. And all those assumptions have to either get closed out through the design process, through investigation or design, or they become a risk, and the risk then has a mitigation plan, and that's then carried forward through to construction, and things that then can't be mitigated through to construction and handed over to the operator. But in all things, we've all tried to, all unknowns, we try to resolve them as early as possible to transfer as little risk over to subsequent stages in the project. I'd like to say it was terribly innovative, but I think it's just good, thorough and fundamental systems assurance process to get us through that.
No, it's. I remember my first safety design workshop to seeing 53 people in the room when I turned up. I was, I think, it was one of the more well attended safety design sessions, and there were some interesting questions asked by the various stakeholders there. So very early on, we knew we had a lot of people to work with. It was very interesting. And Trevor, I guess I just want to delve a little bit deeper on one of the statements that you made a bit earlier about working with a team on site. I've been on site and I've looked up and I've seen the myriad of cables and everything else. How did the collaboration between the design team, the construction team, and the stakeholders work in untangling what could be described as a spider web of cables? How did that work, and how did we respond when we just genuinely couldn't figure out what it was?
Yeah, with difficulty, because it did involve, let's say, everybody getting a bit hands-on at the start, including, much like I mentioned at the start of our presentation, with the workshops, with Sydney Trains workshops with Laing. I think the key to the whole process was, like any large problem, tackle it portion by portion in a methodical fashion. So it was all about, again, informed by constructability, informed by sequencing, identifying the key assets that we needed to tackle up front, trace the existing services, condition report to the existing services. And there was many a day spent at the start of the project when we were initially developing our designs, where it was Sydney Trains, TFNSW, Metro, Laing O'Rourke, and part of AGJV on site, literally going through each discipline step by step, tracing what we needed to find. If there was more invasive areas that needed to be looked at, aka let's say a concourse, an existing concourse we needed to see above the ceiling, then it was a case of planning that process, getting endorsement and engagement with the relevant stakeholders, taking down those ceilings at a time when it was going to have as little impact to the station operation as possible. So different processes. It was all about communication at the end of the day, communication and putting it a robust plan to try to get the information from a complex existing station in order to inform our design development moving forward.
Thank you. Yeah, I remember those early workshops, just trying to find, and I remember finding one or two plant rooms that we didn't expect to find, and one or two cold rooms we didn't think existed. So there was
that's right.
It was certainly flexible in the early stages. Before
we commenced the project, there's two whole platforms, 26, 27, that I never knew existed, more commonly known as the ghost platforms, and we ended up, as part of the design, turning those into major plant spaces for the operation of the new areas. So it was complex and but thoroughly enjoyable process at the same time.
Excellent. I guess it will blend in a little bit now to it's been discussed once or twice about how central the customer was. Iris, I guess sort of you were modeling the person, so you were probably one of the more centered, more customer-centered design representatives. Just how central was the customer to everything that was happening, and how was that reflected in the process?
The customer was at the heart of the entire design process, and being able to work in a live environment is something that you don't really get to do on many projects, and being able to see how people actually move and interact with the overall construction methodology constantly evolving and constantly changing while maintaining customer safety at the forefront of everything that we did as part of, or that we've done so far as part of the process, and doing going forward. So yeah, like I mentioned, a live environment, it's constantly changing. And I guess one example that I might use in terms of where we applied a customer focus as part of the overall project was on the platforms. So we've had all this hoarding up on the platforms in order to construct the various elements within the station, and simple things like wayfinding and signage played a critical role in directing customers in terms of where they needed to go. And what part of the station they might need to get to. So as Trevor was talking around the servicing and how they use the downtime in order to construct or to build some of the more critical nitty-gritty elements of the station, come Monday morning, that's back to like a new layout, and you go to the station on a Friday to go home, and come Monday morning, you're like, oh, hello, brand new layout. So yeah, it's constantly changing, constantly evolving, and understanding what the customer's needs are and how they'll interact with the overall design was actually critical in making sure that we've allowed for enough space for them.
And Nicole, I guess maybe a question to yourself. Iris has mentioned sort of gaining the trust, and you've mentioned as well. What were some of the bigger challenges in getting the buy-in, I guess, early on, and then maintaining that commitment and the trust levels in what you were doing?
Yeah, the stakeholders are many and varied within Sydney Trains, Sydney Metro, the greater Sydney City. There are many stakeholders, and gaining all of their trust is fundamental to keeping this project going, and we certainly have done that. And I think we have an open relationship with both Sydney Trains and Sydney Metro about what we're going to do. The things that Iris helped with immensely is actually with the facts. This is the modelling. We would show them the modelling of this is what the customer is going to do throughout the station. And I remember running into Iris was there at 7 o'clock on a Monday morning when we opened the hoarding for the Olympic Tunnel staircase diversion. We're watching the people go past with Sydney Trains, making sure that the flow of pedestrians was still running fully. So we were there through the process. We're making sure we listened to what they asked for, and absolutely listen to what they asked for, because they know the customers better than we do. They know their station. It is their station better than we do, and listening to them and adopting what we could and negotiating what we couldn't do to allow for some of this. And we worked nights and weekends to try and accommodate some of these more complicated changes that we needed to do. And and so far so good. You know, it's been a fantastic success of maintaining pedestrian flow throughout the station.
Absolutely. I guess we've talked about customers in the sense of users of the station. I guess, Trevor, an interesting thought that I had when we were thinking about this is customers in terms of Sydney Trains and Sydney Metro being quite divergent, but they're meeting in the middle in this station. How did the design adapt to what are quite different stakeholder and customer requirements within the station?
Yeah, I think one of the most important aspects of that is definitely it has to be intuitive to the customer. While it is obviously a Sydney Metro area and a Sydney Trains area, and even a light rail area out in another section of the project. At the end of the day, the customer is just trying to get around it in an intuitive fashion. So, I mean, if I use it as an example of the lighting design, the lighting methodology and philosophy, it really was a process of trying to ensure that the lighting that's in the new station, as well as the lighting that's been upgraded in the existing areas of the station, spoke to each other. And what I mean by that is it flowed from one area to another. It made it an intuitive transition from a metro area to a Sydney Trains area without diminishing the significance of a brand new important train station underground for the metro areas as well. Along with that, on a more technical note, from a fire and life safety aspect, two dedicated systems, but communicating as one for the station as a whole as well.
Yeah, I remember from the design process getting a level of commonality between two very different design standards, or two different sets of design standards, and between all of them was a great challenge.
Yeah. It was integration from a technical as well as a customer intuitive aspect was probably the two most important points from a services point of view when you look at the two distinct areas.
I guess before we sort of get to the questions from the crowd, I wanted to just sort of touch a little bit on the impact of COVID-19 on the project. Given it is still a live construction site and there's still design works going on at the same time, there's definitely some challenges, as reflected in the fact that we're all currently sitting in our homes and talking to the rest of everyone. I guess, Nicole, being the lead on site, how are things going? How have you had to respond?
We've been very, very lucky as an industry that construction is considered an essential service by the government, and there has been limited restrictions. We have had some challenges in maintaining the social distancing requirements that we required on site, but that's been adopted essentially fantastically with some innovation from our construction team. We have our pre-start areas set up in a 2x2 grid on the ground, so we can make sure that everybody is keeping their social distancing when we need to on site and within the areas as well. This is a highly visible construction site as well. Many of our platforms you can see here, we might be working on one, but the platform next door is open to the public and fully visible. So maintaining the social distancing not only is important to us, but is also important that that's being portrayed into society. We've also had the lucky, I guess, advantage of this. So COVID-19 with people and homeschooling and working from home has meant that pedestrian numbers have dropped significantly. So I think Eris will confirm the numbers are normally in the 270,000 people a day or something like that, and they've dropped down to 30,000 a day, for instance. They're roughly numbers. So you can see that's allowed us to do actually additional works because there are less people in the station. So it's allowed works that normally happen at night, maybe being done as day works instead. So the works, and that's allowed us to progress significantly faster in some areas where we've been able to. It's been a slight advantage.
Yeah, fascinating. I hadn't actually heard those numbers myself. So I guess, Iris, you spend an inordinate amount of time getting these areas up and running, and then you get 1/5 of the volume of people that you're expecting. How were we able to help the team respond to that?
I think it's been a team effort to get it all running, a massive team effort. It's yeah, so in terms of the volumes, like although it's a slight decrease, we still need to abide to social distancing. So even within the design process, even though the total volume is much lower, there are elements that need to consider. So keeping 1.5 meters between the next person, and how does that actually, will the changes to the construction sequencing actually be able to meet those requirements is what we kind of went through.
Yeah.
But yeah, with the reduction, generally, I think it's generally helped.
It's sorry, your answer has made me think. I mean, in pedestrian levels, we talk about the Fruin level of service and the spacing between people. Has that changed across this project in the industry when we're thinking about Fruin levels of service and what's acceptable and not when we put in the layer of social distancing?
Yes, as a short answer, and I guess it's an evolving conversation that I don't doubt will be at the forefront of future designs.
And I guess Liam, as the design manager from a design perspective, how's the design team had to adapt to the separation of sort of people within the design office and then also not having necessarily the same access to site?
Look, I think we've done very well, actually. I think we set up early in the project to be very digital in how we deliver the project. So both, the design partners and Laing O'Rourke are all very digitally orientated. So everything we have is all our systems are cloud-based. So we had no set structure in an office. We did have a design office where the core team were located. We actually had a very international design team. So we had people all across Australia working on the project. Iris herself is Perth-based, so she was one of the non-office-based people for us. We have people in New Zealand. We have significant design teams working for us in South Africa, the Philippines, and Vietnam, and a scattering of people across the globe also helping. So we're from day one, we were always going to be based on digital systems and on digital collaboration tools. So when we had to, the other thing, thankfully, we were close towards the end of the design, but we're still doing design. So when COVID hit, we were well placed to become more of a dispersed team. So we already were quite a dispersed team, but the core team suddenly being dispersed. So I think from a systems point of view, we were well there. I think what engineers tend to miss is getting together around a whiteboard and solving problems, and that truly interactive, collaborative process. I think we've adapted to that, those sort of more one-on-one interactions or more closer interactions. There are a lot of tools we've used. There's a plethora of things out there. I think Teams has become one of the greatest pieces of software the whole industry's ever known for now. So we were using a little bit beforehand. Now it's become the status quo, and there's a whole lot of great things you can do through that. So certainly, I think we moved into social isolation fairly smoothly, and I certainly haven't felt an impact on the design process. We've certainly kept delivering.
It's been quite remarkable to see how the industry's adapted so quickly. So it's been great. They were probably all the questions that I had pre-thought from this. I guess we've got just over 250 odd people on here, so hopefully we can get a few questions from the audience that I'll try and filter through to the rest of you.
We've actually had a lot of questions come through, so I'll try my best to sort of cover a range of them. One that came through is sort of more a comment for yourselves, which was that they were very impressed with the grave finding sensitivities, and in particular the lengths taken to find ancestors, because their family was contacted out of the blue and one of their ancestors was actually one of the individuals that was located. So there you go, a little bit of information for yourselves. We've had a question around risk registers. The question is it one risk register for the entire project or separate risk registers for the different phases? So I'm not sure who to answer that to.
Yeah, I'll jump in initially. So we have one risk register, and the intent is actually that gets passed through each phase as we go through. So design initially, the designers, we've held the risk register, we've managed it. We work. It is a collaborative input process with us and all the stakeholders. But and at some point in the very near future, we'll be handing that hazard log over and the risk register over to Laing O'Rourke, who'll then own that, and then once they're finished, they'll pass it on to Sydney Trains and Sydney Metro. Now, one of the challenges with all the stakeholders in the risk register is actually having 3 key stakeholders, and that's being Sydney Trains, Sydney Metro, and also the final operator. So we've actually run a risk register which has, for those who are into the details, 3 different types of risk ratings in there. So every risk is actually assessed against a Sydney Trains matrix, a Sydney Metro matrix, and an operator matrix. So everyone's got their view in there. Everyone's also got their outputs in a format that works into their risk management system.
Wow, certainly a much more complex risk register than what we have here at ARA. You mentioned the 3 different entities. We've had a question around what role does the central team have in managing the integration of the station works with the rail system, screen doors, fire and life safety systems, etc. And is the integration progressing well? Who would be best placed to answer that?
So I might jump in with initially. Yes, during the design development, we mentioned earlier on that the different stakeholder designs, timeframes, and programs were different. So the method and way that while designing Central Station, especially from a services point of view, that was managed is the fact that we would, through workshops and through collaborating with those individual stakeholders, especially TSOM and line-wide, we developed their dedicated rooms, which included all the building services provisions, along with the spatial allowances and any special requirements that they may need from room data sheets that we were provided to facilitate those stakeholders fitting out those rooms at a later date. So that collaboration was set up at the initial start of the project when we were, again, through the digital environment and that common data environment, populating the information that we'd received from them. That has been refined as the project has been developing, and that is ongoing to this day. Progressing quite well.
I guess I'll jump in because there's 3 or 4 questions here that can probably be grouped. And Iris, there's a lot of focus on some of the pedestrian modelling, and it comes through in a couple of forms. So one of the questions was around how is the station allowed for the fact that there's a number of everyday users, but also tourists? And then how has the model been validated during the various stages to give confidence of what's going on? And then how is that adapted for the future stages?
All right, so in terms of the various users, so obviously Central does consider an array of users, in particular, given that it does have the airport line that goes through it. So platform 23 allows for different user classes outside of the general commuter peak, and behaviour of different users is different. So the way that a tourist interacts with the station is different to the commuter. So we've accommodated that within the model. At a really high level, you consider different behaviours and how people actually move through the model, and there's been different inputs that we've allocated to the model in order to allow for different users who actually use the station on a day-to-day basis. We have, given that it is a model, we have been considering generally the worst case scenario, or the best case scenario, some might say, when the station is the busiest, which generally does occur during the peak periods on a Monday to Friday in the AM and the PM peak, which is generally associated with a commuter peak. What was the second question, Jason? Second part of that question?
I think it was talking about the validation of what we expected on site, and then how was that used, or how was that considered in the next phase of works?
Yeah, so as part of the overall model, we did have a calibrated and validated model prior to commencing any of the work. Given that it is a live station, that was double checked, and that was used for the modelling going forward. Given that the project has been going on for about 2 or more years, obviously changes to pedestrian behaviour has occurred. One of the notable changes has been an introduction of a changed train timetable from what we initially had within the model. So we've been able to adapt our model to reflect the changes in the train timetable, and obviously reflect a slight change to the overall customer behaviour within the model as a whole.
I'm trying to group a few of these up. Liam, there seems to be a bit of interest in the diagonal bracing and how that's been used to facilitate some of the interesting things. So a little bit more about why it was different, and then potentially from a staging perspective, how that's helped from yourself.
Yeah, I'd love to have a drawing to show everyone on that one, but I don't. So I think in terms of diagonal bracing, I mean, obviously doesn't sound that innovative itself, but it actually, what we've done is the diagonal bracing takes all the, if you think of this as a box, when we come down to the first level, that's actually the pedestrian concourse below the existing train lines. And the diagonal bracing sits directly below that and takes all the load, the vertical load from the train sitting above, and takes it into the rock, directly into the rock laterally. So then what we essentially have is a structure which sits above the excavation and takes all the train load, which is by far the largest portion, and directs that laterally in, and then vertically into the rocks on each side of the excavation. So then we've got a large space below that, which essentially doesn't require to put vertical load onto the rock at the base of the excavation. So all the internal structures are actually hung from that. And there's a lot of work that goes around this, because this is a deep excavation rock, and rock moves. So rocks, Sydney is one of the greatest places in the world to do excavation, because Sydney sandstone is fantastic. But even in Sydney sandstone, the rock will move. So the diagonal bracing had to accommodate the movements as well. So there's actually temporary jacking in place to accommodate the movement as we excavate down, to allow the relaxation in the rock to be accommodated before the structure is actually locked off into the permanent load. So it's a very complex approach to how we've actually done this. It's not simply diagonal bracing, taking into account all the construction staging, how we deal with that. Hopefully, I think there's a video that might be coming out later on attached to the recording of this will show some images of that structure and how it actually works. And I'm sure for those who are really into structural engineering, there will definitely be some papers written coming out in the next year or so on how we've done this.
Definitely, I believe there's been 1 or 2 posts put on LinkedIn about the largest excavation of sandstone 200-metre long strip in Sydney for a while as well. So
yeah, I think someone's referred to it as the largest test pit in Australia. So we know what the ground conditions are pretty well now.
Excellent. Trevor, there's 1 or 2 questions, if I can group them up, talking about the fact that this is a 100-year-old station and it's got a 100-year design life moving forward. So there's some interesting questions around how we lifted up the existing asset and are future-proofing it for the next 100 years ahead with services and all the rest of it.
Yes, so I suppose it kind of ties into that interfacing with existing services piece again. one of the main key design criteria was obviously enough those expectation of lifetime for the asset. So with anything, you know, your electrical systems, your hydraulic systems, services in general won't last as long as structural, the structural services. But for the most part, any new area has basically been designed and developed. The design has been developed based on brand new services to those areas. So obviously, enough the Metro box that we're referring to is all new equipment for those areas, along with any assets in an existing area which our new scope of works impacts. It generally has been upgraded to new services as well. Within Australia standards, within typical building services design development, you have these spare capacities, along with we've had multiple workshops with the sustainability team and the climate change assessment teams to inform the services capacities, inform all the services designs in regards to, you know, increase in ambient temperature in the station, increase in water usage in the station as the amount of customers increases over time, right into the future. I think it's 50 years into the future or something is the criteria surrounding that from off the top of my head. But all these bits and pieces in regards to future proofing and climate change, along with sustainability procedures, all of those kind of things informed the design moving forward. Obviously, you know, when you're looking to reuse some of the building services assets, they just weren't capable of doing that. So therefore, those kind of services would have been upgraded as well, even if they were existing areas.
Thanks. And Nicole, I guess there's one or two here in terms of measuring levels of trust. So one of the interesting questions was, through structural monitoring or other mechanisms, what level of confidence have the construction team been able to give to Sydney Trains in this live environment as to making sure it's still safe? What measures do you have in place to sort of track that in real time?
Yeah, there's some really extensive instrumentation and monitoring that goes across the whole site, not just the areas that are close to where we are, but right across all the platforms, that even ones we're not impacting. So there is extensive testing that's monitored constantly, continual testing, and there's also the DLAP, you know, DLAP surveys that were done at the very start of the project, and any records there that we have as well if anything is shifting and moving around. Some of the interesting things I guess we haven't really touched on is around maintaining the Devonshire Street tunnel throughout the project and keeping that in place. That has heavily also probably a tender winning idea that came through to maintain it instead of demolishing and replacing and a few other things. But maintaining that is heavily monitored throughout the project since the very start, because any movement in that is an existing live tunnel, and we need to make sure it's not moving anywhere.
Excellent. Thanks, Nicole. I think that that just brings us up onto the 1:30 mark. So we are unfortunately out of time. I'm happy to collate some of these questions, and we can issue out a bit of a summary of any of the ones that we did miss. But thank you very much for answering the questions and saving me having to talk for 45 minutes on my own team. I guess I'll hand back to is there anything to close, or does everyone just start logging out?
Yeah, look, thank you, Jason, and thanks to all of you for your sharing some of your experience. It's one hell of a project. And we actually clocked over 300 attendees, so we had some drop off towards the end, but I think that's really an indication of the level of interest in what you're delivering. And noting, I think at the beginning you said that the completion timeframe is 2024, so hopefully we can, you know, bring you all back together further along the project to share a bit of an update with everyone. Thank you so much. We have another webinar scheduled for next Wednesday. We've got Adam Williams from Kiwi Rail joining us, and he will be briefing everybody on the future of rail in New Zealand. So thank you to everyone. I encourage you to register for that webinar, and otherwise enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks again, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.